Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about Schitt's Creek, which is a show that many of you, I'm sure, have known about for years. People have been recommending this show to Annalise and I for years now, and we just never got around to watching it. We finally did get around to starting it last week. It is every bit as fantastic as people have been saying that it is. Such a funny show. We're up to we're a couple episodes, 2 episodes into the second season now. The premise of the show is that this family of four, husband, wife, and two kids who are very much, grown up. They're 29 and 27. Anyway, this family of four that were extremely rich, the Roses, they suddenly lose all of their money, and they are, suddenly living in very kind of reduced circumstances in this small town called Schitt's Creek, and it's hilarious on many levels. But the episode that we just watched, I absolutely adored it. It's called Family Dinner, and it's the mom, Moira. She decides she's going to cook family dinner, and immediately her family is looking at her and kind of giggling, and they just think, what are you talking about? You don't know how to cook, right? Because for years they were very, very wealthy, so they had cooks, personal chefs that would cook for them. They had maids that would do all of their cleaning. They had, very expensive stuff. So she hasn't cooked in decades, right? And so she tries to cook this meal, and it's very comical. It's a total disaster. It's practically inedible when she finally makes it. And there's this wonderful little exchange between her and her 29-year-old son, David, at the end of the episode, where she says, when I was a little girl, I used to know how to make bread from scratch in a small little kitchen, right? I knew how to make a bed. I knew how to turn on a car without the key. She just goes through this like litany of life skills that she had when she was younger. And she said, and then I met your father, right? And father, right, Johnny Rose, who is super, super rich. And so suddenly she says, I could pay people to do all these things for me. I didn't need to do any of those things, right? And she says, I always figured that if, God forbid, I ever needed those skills again, it would be very easy, and they would be there, right? Those competencies would still be there. And she said, but I was wrong. I've lost all of those skills. And she says, and so now I know what it feels like to be completely helpless, like you and your sister, right? And I just burst out laughing so loud. I mean, this is just, I find this absolutely hilarious. I've seen this in real life a number of times. I see it especially with students who are that I see in my classes who are fairly recent immigrants to Canada from third world countries, and they were members of the elite in their country, or members of the kind of upper middle class, like the wealthiest people in countries where there was a massive separation between rich and poor, and there was a large labor pool of people that you can get to work for nothing, right? So somebody who is let's say like a doctor, like a specialist living, who's thinking one family in particular where they Coptic Christians in Egypt, and so they were doing pretty well, right? And they were definitely among the wealthier people in the country, but money just goes much farther in a place like that. So as a as a well-to-do professional, you can afford to have somebody, a maid that cleans your house. You can afford to have a cook, right, that does all the cooking. You can afford to have like a chauffeur, that like a driver that drives you around everywhere. You can afford to, so you can have nannies that look after your kids, right? And so I've heard this story many times from students like this, where they say their parents, when they immigrate to Canada, it's a huge shock, not just because you're living in a new country and a new culture. It's because they suddenly have to learn how to like cook, right? Because they haven't cooked like in decades, right? They suddenly have to learn how to like clean their own house, because they can't afford, even if they're doing very well here, you can't afford to have like a staff of 6. I mean, only the ultra rich, even very wealthy people in Canada, in the United States, cannot afford to have a house staff of 6 people, right? That's very, very expensive. So all these people suddenly have to learn how to they have to get driver's licenses and learn how to drive their own car, because they don't know how to drive their own car. They have to learn how to cook, how to clean. They have to learn how to actually take care of their own kids, because they've outsourced looking after their own kids for years. They've had other people basically doing almost all of the heavy lifting of parenting, right? So they often don't even know their own kids very well. They've had other people were helping their kids with their homework and putting them to bed and disciplining them even, right? So it's really quite fascinating. And I think what this points to is something that we don't talk about that much these days, which is that privilege is not always a privilege, right? I think we tend to, in our discussion of privilege, we tend to imagine that it's very straightforward, that you get a certain amount of privilege points, and that like guarantees you a better result or a great result. I know if you ask the people who are theorists of this, they will say, well, we're really just talking about probabilities, and we're talking about averages, and about but in the way in which the terms and the language is kind of marshaled in popular culture, in everyday discussions, among just regular citizens and activists and people online and stuff like that, it's not used in that careful way at all. It's usually imagined in a very sort of one-to-one way, that okay, I've got X amount of privilege points, and so I'm going to have a guaranteed to have a good result. It's not always that way at all, actually. So what you see in Schitt's Creek is something that actually does happen with some regularity in the world, which is where privilege actually renders you very weak and helpless and pathetic, right? I kept thinking in that episode of Schitt's Creek of the fairy tale of the princess and the pea, right? Where the way that she proves that she's a real princess is by being this unbelievable, like, fragile snowflake that can't get a good night's sleep unless she has absolutely perfect conditions, right? She needs to have if there's one little pea under all of these mattresses, she can feel it, and it just ruins her entire night's sleep, right? And you imagine this princess, if she were alive today, she would be the kind of person who is so hypersensitive that if one little thing in their daily routine goes wrong, it destroys their day. So if the barista at the cafe doesn't make their soy latte exactly the right way, they're pissed off the entire day about it, and they're really angry. Or if their yoga instructor, right, is not the regular yoga instructor, is not at the studio, right, they suddenly are like really upset about that, right, and it ruins their whole day, right? Or if their therapist has to cancel an appointment or something like that, they're completely ruined, right? They just need like some sort of rainforest orchid right? They need to have the exact kind of light and humidity and temperature and exactly the right conditions for them to flourish, right? So there is like that side to privilege where it can actually enfeeble you, and I think that's an interesting thing to contemplate. Now, there is, of course, another side, a kind of a flip side to this whole issue, which I think is creepy, and which is that essentially, and I would say the best book on this that I've read recently is Daniel Markowitz's book, The Meritocracy Trap. And what he argues there is that privilege used to work, right? The old kind of like Mad Men, Don Draper world of privilege, where it was like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males who had this kind of exclusive club, and they kept women out of the club, and they kept Jews out of the club, and they kept the brown and black people out of the club, and they kept gays out of the club, and so on and so forth. And that world, privilege was very much kind of a function of your membership within a particular tribe, right, a particular group. And he says, so what they tried to replace that with, and what they largely have replaced that with, is this meritocratic elite, right? And this was supposed to be, a great advance over that previous elite. And Markowitz says, in many ways, it absolutely was a great advance, right? Our new elite is much more diverse in terms of its gender composition and its ethnic and racial composition, the different kinds of sexual orientations, and all that stuff. It's more diverse in the sense of a Benetton ad. It's more kind of in terms of those categories. But he says, in many ways, the new elite is actually far more closed off to anybody else getting into it than the old elite, right? Because now he gives all these like crazy stats on, he says the new meritocratic elite, essentially these are parents that are not like the Roses in Schitt's Creek, right? These are parents who their great privilege and wealth, they haven't sort of used it to render their kids ridiculously infantile and backward, right? These are the meritocratic elites. What they do instead is they use all of that money and all those resources and they invest it in their kids, and they send their kids to the absolute best schools, and they spend a lot of money on tutors and on extracurricular activities, and they take their kids on like really educational trips to see the pyramids or to Mayan ruins, or go to Europe and look at museums, and go to China to the Great Wall of China. And kids have all these incredible experiences. They invest in their skills a great deal. So very often these Markowitz says, like, the children of these elite, by the time they're 20 years old, they are completely fluent in Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, English, French. They can program in 3 different computer languages. They speak, they can play a number of musical instruments. So there's all these ways in which their skill set is so far advanced to what you could possibly get if you were even just like middle class, or much less working class, right? And because of this, he says that the increasingly, like, the percentage of students at the top schools, the top elite schools in the United States, the percentage of students who got into those schools from public schools was fairly high, right, in 1960, 1970, but it's been going down for the last couple decades, and now it is virtually impossible to get into one of the best schools in the United States from a public school now. It's pretty much impossible, right? And because the elite, it's not just their connections, right? They are so much better trained than everybody else that it's just not a fair fight anymore, right? So it's not just them pulling strings and with connections. It's that they actually are, when you test them on everything from math to languages to general knowledge, they tend to be 2 or 3 grade levels above the children of the meritocratic elite. They tend to be 2 or 3 grade levels ahead of the middle class, the regular kind of middle class Americans on almost every single thing. So when they actually are outperforming them, right? So anyway, it's very interesting how the privilege issue can sort of go either way. It can either render your kids extraordinarily weak and helpless and pathetic, like the Roses, which on this fabulous show Schitt's Creek, or privilege, if parents use it wisely, they can invest in their kids and they can make their kids extraordinarily competent and so highly skilled that they basically are going to outperform everybody else, and it's going to create this like very, very unequal society that we're increasingly seeing right now, right? So anyway, it's a much more interesting situation than people often give it credit for. But anyway, go watch Schitt's Creek. You'll thank me. It's hilarious.